You've been staring at this thing for 2 hours. Maybe it's a leaking faucet, and there's a wrench in your hand, and water on the floor, and you've already watched 3 tutorials, each one contradicting the last, and your back hurts from the angle you've been crouched in, and there's a plumber in your phone contacts who could be here in 20 minutes. You haven't called. Maybe it's a software problem at work, and you've been buried in forums and documentation since lunch, and your coworker 2 desks over solved the exact same issue last month, and you know this because you overheard them talking about it. You haven't asked. Maybe it's something heavier than a faucet or a spreadsheet, something emotional, something that's been sitting in your chest for weeks, and there are people in your life who would listen, who have literally said the words "call me anytime," and you believe them. You do, but your fingers won't dial the number because somewhere between knowing you could ask and actually asking, there's a wall that has nothing to do with the phone and everything to do with who you think you stop being, the moment you say, "I need help." And the strangest part? You're not even frustrated by the struggle. There's something inside the difficulty that almost feels like fuel. Every failed attempt is still your attempt. Every wrong answer is still an answer you found yourself. And somewhere in the back of your brain, underneath the exhaustion and the sore back and the 4th tutorial, there's a quiet satisfaction that nobody else is in this room right now, just you and the problem. And even if it takes all night, when you finally crack it, that victory will belong entirely to you, and you won't have to share credit with anyone, not even someone you trust, because trust was never really the issue. At least that's the version of this you tell yourself, and parts of it are true, but not all of it. And the parts that aren't true are the parts that matter most. If any of this sounds like someone you know, and by someone I mean you, hit like on this video, because the person who needs to see this is probably too stubborn to search for it themselves. Here's the defense case first, because it deserves one. Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, psychologists at the University of Rochester, spent decades developing what they called self-determination theory. And at the core of it sits a finding that's been replicated across cultures, age groups, and contexts with remarkable consistency. Human beings have 3 basic psychological needs: competence, relatedness, and autonomy. The need to feel capable, the need to feel connected, and the need to feel that your actions originate from your own will rather than external pressure. When those 3 needs are met, people thrive. When they're frustrated, people deteriorate. And autonomy, the need to feel self-directed, isn't some bonus feature of a well-adjusted personality. It's foundational. It's wired in. The desire to figure things out on your own, to solve your own problems, to stand inside your own capability, that isn't a dysfunction. It's 1/3 of the psychological foundation that makes a human being feel like a human being. So when you spend 5 hours solving something alone that a 5-minute conversation could have resolved, part of what's happening is genuinely healthy. You're feeding a core psychological need. The competence you build by struggling through something alone is real. The autonomy you feel when you arrive at the answer without assistance is real. The quiet internal record of, "I did this, nobody helped, I figured it out," that's real too. And it's currency. It spends in your self-concept. It buys stability in a world that feels unstable. It builds something inside you that advice, shortcuts, and borrowed answers simply cannot replicate. That's the defense. And it's solid. If this were the whole story, you wouldn't be watching this video at 2 in the morning with a feeling in your chest that you're about to hear something uncomfortably familiar. Because there's a difference, and it's a difference most people go their entire lives without clearly seeing, between someone who chooses independence and someone who can't choose anything else. And that difference isn't philosophical, it's architectural. It lives in the nervous system, and the blueprints were drawn a very long time ago. John Bowlby, the British psychologist who essentially invented attachment theory in the mid-20th century, observed something in children that reshaped the entire field of developmental psychology. Children who had consistent, reliable caregivers, adults who showed up when the child was distressed and responded with appropriate comfort, these children developed what Bowlby called secure attachment. They learned that the world contains people who can be depended upon, and as adults, they could ask for help without it threatening their identity, because the foundation of their self-concept already included the experience of being safely dependent. But a specific group of children, the ones whose caregivers were inconsistent or emotionally unavailable or present in body but absent in every other measurable way, These children developed a different adaptation entirely. Bowlby and later Mary Ainsworth identified it as avoidant attachment, and the defining characteristic wasn't hostility toward others, it wasn't obvious distrust, it was something much quieter. These children learned to suppress their dependency needs, not eliminate them, suppress them. The need was still there. The reach was still there. But the hand pulled back before it made contact, because every early experience taught the same lesson. Reaching doesn't work. Or worse, reaching makes things harder. The parent gets overwhelmed. The parent gets irritated. The parent handles your need like it's a task on a list they didn't sign up for. And the child, being brilliantly adaptive in the way all children are, stops reaching. Not because they don't need, because needing stopped being safe. And that child grows up, and that child becomes you, the one who watches 4 tutorials, the one who sits with the problem until midnight, the one whose friends describe as independent and self-sufficient and strong, and who hears those words and feels pride, and something else underneath the pride that's harder to name, something that sounds almost like loneliness, if loneliness could be dressed in competence and made to look intentional. Here's what I mean when I say the difference matters. The person with healthy autonomy can ask for help, and it feels like a tool, one option among many. They assess the situation, decide whether solving it alone or asking for assistance is more efficient, and they choose without existential weight attached to either option. Asking doesn't diminish them. It's a strategy. Nothing more. The person with compulsive self-reliance cannot ask for help and have it feel like a tool. For them, asking is not a strategy. It's a surrender. It means something about who they are. And what it means is the thing they've spent their entire life making sure nobody ever has cause to say about them. That they're not enough, that they can't handle it, that they need. And need, somewhere in the deep unspoken operating system of their psyche, is the most dangerous thing a person can be caught doing. Francis Flynn at Stanford and Vanessa Lake at Columbia published a study in 2008 that uncovered something both obvious and devastating about help-seeking behavior. Across multiple experiments, they found that people consistently and dramatically underestimate how willing others are to help them. Participants predicted that strangers, colleagues, and acquaintances would say no to requests for assistance at rates far higher than the actual refusal rates. The world, it turns out, is considerably more generous than the person who won't ask believes it to be. But the study revealed something even more important than the miscalculation itself. The reason people didn't ask wasn't primarily a prediction about whether help would be available. It was a judgment about what asking would cost them internally. They weren't thinking about the other person's willingness. They were thinking about what it would mean about themselves to need it. The barrier was never external. It was interior, and it was installed so early and so deeply that it doesn't feel like a barrier anymore. It feels like character. I want you to think about something, and if you're comfortable, tell me in the comments. When was the last time you asked someone for help with something that actually mattered? Not directions, not passing the salt, not a surface-level favor that costs nothing emotionally to request, something real, something where the asking itself felt exposing. How long ago was that? And what happened in your body when you tried? Because here's what nobody tells the person who does everything alone. The cost isn't just time. It's not just efficiency lost. It's not just the sore back from the faucet you could have had fixed by noon. The cost is something that accumulates so slowly you don't notice it happening until one day you're standing in a room full of people who care about you and you feel completely alone. Not because they aren't there, because you've trained yourself so thoroughly to operate without them that their presence has become decorative. They're in your life. They're not in your infrastructure. You built the entire building yourself, and there's no door where someone else could enter and load bear beside you because the blueprint never included one. Carolina Diehl and her colleagues at the University of Mannheim published research in 2018 that drew a direct line between early attachment patterns and adult help-seeking behavior. What they found was not surprising to anyone who studied attachment, but it was clarifying in its specificity. Individuals with avoidant attachment styles didn't just avoid asking for help. They actively reframed the need for help as unnecessary. They didn't just decline assistance. They constructed entire internal narratives about why assistance was inferior to self-reliance. The defense wasn't passive, it was creative. It built philosophies, it built identities, It turned a wound into a worldview and called it strength. And that's the part I need to say directly, because I think you can hear it now, without it feeling like an attack. Your independence is real. What you've built alone is genuinely impressive. The competence you carry, the problems you've solved at midnight with nobody watching, the fact that people rely on you precisely because you've never relied on them, all of that is true. Nobody is taking that from you. But the thing that makes you good at being alone is the same thing that makes you unable to be anything else. And those are not the same virtue. One is a skill, the other is a cage built from the same material as the skill, which is exactly why it's so hard to see from inside. You don't need to become someone who asks for help with everything. That would be a different kind of dysfunction wearing a recovery costume. But you might need to sit with a question you've been avoiding longer than any faucet or spreadsheet or tutorial. The question isn't, can you do this alone? You've answered that 1,000 times. You can. You always can. The question is, what are you protecting by making sure you always do? Because the answer to that question has a name. And the name probably isn't independence. It's probably closer to safety. And the safety it's providing is from a version of vulnerability that hurt you once, a long time ago, in a room you don't think about anymore, with a person who was supposed to help and didn't, or couldn't, or helped in a way that cost more than doing it alone ever would. That room doesn't exist anymore, but the rule you wrote inside it still runs every time your finger hovers over someone's name in your phone and then puts it back in your pocket. Every time you choose the 4th tutorial. Every time the struggle feels better than the asking. The rule is still running, and it's running on old data. You are allowed to update it, not demolish it, not override it with some motivational poster about vulnerability. Just update it. The same way you'd update anything that worked perfectly for its original purpose, but is now solving a problem that no longer exists, in a context that no longer applies. The next time you're 3 hours into something you could solve with a single conversation, try something small. Not the big ask, not the emotional confession, just a small, almost weightless request. Something with low stakes and a high probability of yes. And when the person says yes, and they will, don't watch what they do. Watch what happens inside you. Watch the flinch. Watch the impulse to say, never mind, I figured it out. Watch the almost physical need to retract the request the moment it leaves your mouth. That flinch is the data. That flinch is the old room. And noticing it, just noticing it without obeying it, is the first time in maybe your entire life that you'll be fixing something by not fixing it alone. The wrench is still yours. The tutorials are still there. The midnight problem-solving sessions that nobody knows about, those are still part of who you are. But you might find, if you let someone else into the room just once, that the problem gets solved in 5 minutes, and the world doesn't end, and you didn't become less, and the person didn't leave, and the thing you were protecting all this time was already safe. It was always safe. You just never had the chance to find that out. Because you never stopped solving long enough to check. Subscribe and turn on notifications. What I'm covering next builds directly on what we just walked through together. And if this one landed, that one is going to explain something you've been carrying even longer. See you there.